An important focus for the LEGO Group when developing some of its largest themes into full intellectual properties is branching out into other forms of media, such as TV shows, video games, and books. Although TV shows based on LEGO themes have become quite commonplace in the past decade, it wasn't always that way. There were several movies produced and attempts at shows, but the prevailing media throughout the time was books. Of course, LEGO's history making books dates well back into the 1900s, but using books as a device to tell stories in the worlds they developed is something brought to the forefront in the early 2000s with the LEGO Bionicle theme especially. Continuing up until now, the journey has been shaky, but that hasn't stopped their efforts. At the forefront, out of their in-house themes, Ninjago has been very heavy on having the option of reading stories all throughout its life. Intended as an enriching experience for the younger builder, older builders, especially for those particular in how they spend their time and on which stories, books do very little for them. As LEGO sets are toys first, it makes sense the priority is on younger builders. But those who are truly passionate about the stories delivered tend to be older, and as they get older, how the story they love is handled is at the forefront of their mind. This dilemma and LEGO's neglectfulness with awareness on this issue could have frightening effects on Ninjago's story in the future. Said dilemma regarding the canon, or storyline at the core of a story, is something of note as what's regarded as canon, in Ninjago's case, is primarily focused in the television show. Having ran the entire lifetime of the LEGO theme itself, nearly 12 years now, that's a lot of story to keep track of. However, unlike Bionicle, the only other theme LEGO created themselves that lasted nearly this long, all of Ninjago's story is primarily found in one place: streaming services. As it's on all of the notable services, and in the hands of so many, it might just be one of LEGO's most accessible adventures overall. Ease of access of stories this long and deep is a necessity if LEGO intends for it to continue into the future. However, not all of what's canon to Ninjago's story is found on streaming. Overall this time LEGO has been making books for Ninjago, the focus has always been on having them on the shelves, rather than them making sense to the overall story of Ninjago. Unless, of course, said books are intended to be a retelling, but it's not uncommon they skip pertinent information. They can even deviate into territory that may contradict the show as well. Depends on the writers, and it depends on if someone's deliberately checking that it makes sense and it remaining in line with the canon story. Considering how often deviation happens, or how close these stories teeter nearing doing so, I'm inclined to believe there isn't someone who is. For someone under the age of 10 who just wants to read a Ninjago story, canon does not matter. It's meant just for fun, and for LEGO it's meant for brand awareness. It does its job. When you get older fans than that involved, those who are likely starting to branch out in stories and media they consume, as well as take on responsibility leading into their adult life, are going to be stricter on what they spend their time reading. Same can be said for those who are already adults as well. This means avoiding things that seem like they've grown out of or don't matter to the stories they're enjoying. In that lies an issue with these books. If they're teetering on whether it's canon or not, or it's very clearly non-canon, they won't bother. Who cares, right? It gets even more cloudy when those in charge of handling the show's direction feel the need to clarify to the fans when a book is canon. Either the book is not canon and they don't realize and then double back, or it is canon, but not because they deliberately made sure that it fits in the story, more it simply does not contradict it. Now, again, there are rare instances where these books are deliberately meant to coincide with the canon of the show, but when you're releasing 10 plus books and comics a year, and after all that time, 100 plus altogether at this point, you can only claim that 9 of those stories are written in conjunction with the canon story, something is not working in a sustainable way. There is no lorekeeper in charge of making everything make sense to retain the canon narrative's integrity. It's worse when you consider that members of the show's production team are also releasing their own stories that happen to fit into canon, but aren't officially developed through LEGO, muddying the waters. Fans who are hungry for content will decide that it is canon, and will angle discussion as if it is, even though there is nothing dictating that, making things even more messy to understand. On top of that, you have multiple video games that also teetered astray from canon. We had instances here where members of production said some of these were canon, only to double back here as well. But then you have something like The Realm of Shadows Live, a stage show exclusive to Legoland Malaysia that happens to be voiced by the show's actors that doesn't contradict canon narratively. You have one party on the production team going, yes, it is canon, while it's writhed with inconsistencies, and another party saying that it's only canon-ish because of said inconsistencies. It's a constant back and forth battle here of what's canon and what's not, but the fact it's spread to so many mediums adds so much to the challenge here. Not only is it hard to keep track of all the mediums Ninjago reaches, but also fans have to worry about limited accessibility as well. We are so lucky that stage show was recorded by someone attending, or it would be lost to anyone seeking canon content out. then again, we shouldn't even need to be seeking out these stories. Efforts should all be put into one place. The more mediums you have involved, the harder your narrative gets to understand and access fully. Star Wars has had this issue for years with all of its books, comics, games, and shows. Bionicle also suffered from these issues as well. Nearly everything produced with a story for Bionicle fits the narrative, or deliberately calls itself an alternate universe from the start, avoiding any contradictions. The accessibility of both of these stories is why it was, or has been, so hard for pretty much anyone outside of hardcore fans to get involved beyond the basics, or what appears at surface level. In this example, Star Wars movies and Bionicle's toys. It's very clear that Bionicle's reaching out into all of these things, beyond an amount that's easy to keep track of, are what caused them to stop reboot the story in the first place back in 2009, only to kill the theme in its entirety a year later. Now in truth, that situation validates LEGO's practice in keeping Ninjago's stories out of the show's canon as much as they did. It avoids spreading things too thin, but as of these past few years, that's began to change. As of recent, we have the Spinjitzu Brothers series, focusing on young Master Wu and Lord Garmadon as they go on zany adventures, and then the Garmadon comic book series meant to bridge the gap between Garmadon's absence and between later seasons of the Ninjago show. These are books that do not contradict canon, but, as you can surely guess, teeter on the edge of disqualifying themselves for being so. Just because they introduce enough to contradict things, or don't end at a spot where we can easily connect the dots. If despite all this effort, these stories can't even commit, why bother in the first place trying to make them canon? Especially if it keeps spreading the Ninjago name so thin. Even more so in the situation that most adults read less than 6 to 16-year-olds do, especially since they aren't forced to due to school. As those kids get older, the less they're reading as well, as they're more focused on classes or other hobbies they've developed. This means that those at an age who are deliberately seeking out Ninjago stories that are canon is so small compared to the audience of younger builders looking to read about Ninjago. Again, why bother making these stories that are canon? Especially since most of these stories are written in a way that is too simple to engage older readers, or is not developed enough to entice a general audience, something that Ninjago's show does not struggle with doing. Best to keep that consistent if the show is what's keeping people around, right? Although, the reverse is true. If things are canon and accessible, the dedicated fans will come regardless of age. So why not put the effort to make these stories, heck regardless of medium, not only canon, but intended for everybody? The way the show handles it is that it simply acts like the canon stuff outside of the show happened without ever acknowledging it did, and yet somehow it works. That is with the exception of a very strange situation, which also leads to our next point. In the show, a mural is painted on the walls of the ninjas' monastery depicting their adventures over the years, including an adventure that has never appeared in the show, only in books, graphic novels to be precise, the Dark Island trilogy. This is perhaps the only written work outside of the show that can say it is definitively part of the story the show tells, outside of retellings of the show in books. Because of this direct acceptance of this story in Ninjago's canon narrative, the books are highly sought after among fans, but not for the sake they want to own a piece of confirmed story. You see, the Dark Island trilogy is a set of hard-backed graphic novels that suffered from terrible distribution issues, causing LEGO to just stop producing them. These books in pristine condition go for so much money now, especially the third installment as it was produced the least. In this modern era, we have the luxury of having books available digitally, but for some strange reason, LEGO just chose not to have them for these. I'm not sure if it was due to those aforementioned distribution issues, or if I simply neglected to do so, considering how bad they've been at preserving their digital efforts throughout all these years, from making their perfectly fine CD-ROM games accessible, to ensuring apps their older yet retired sets require still work on modern hardware. I'm going to bet on the latter. If this has been a struggle of theirs for this long, then I cannot tell you just how worried I am for these modern canon Ninjago stories right now. In Spinjitzu Brothers' case, they also went for the library backing hardback books that the Dark Island trilogy used. Now, I'm not sure if that was the reason behind the distribution issues Dark Island suffered from, but could be a problem if so. Regardless, they are more expensive to produce, meaning their availability as physical books will likely remain limited over time. Same can be said for the Garmadon comic. Already, having the story released like a normal comic would is a strange choice considering children are a minority group in comic book readers. As the New York Times states, the average comic consumer is about 20 years old. Anyone younger is more likely to shop in a bookstore than a genuine comic book store, the former of which rarely carries comics these days, due to that older market no longer seeking them out at these storefronts, or simply buying digitally, which is also something kids aren't likely to do either, due to not having their own form of payment to access them, or not being allowed to use digital devices in the first place. In Garmadon's case, the younger audience target is very strange with all these factors in play against it. One would say it's a foolish decision, especially after several long windows where issues of the comic were not releasing when intended, implying problems on the way to get them into people's hands. In my experience, all the stores I had the option to pick them up at stopped ordering them after issue 3 because no one was buying them in general. Not good. However, the final 5th issue hasn't been out for a month now, and we are already just a month away from a trade paperback version, a graphic novel book collecting the entire adventure. This was likely done to get a full book of a story in younger readers' hands as fast as possible so they can satisfy the target audience they intended to hit in the first place. Why use all those assets to release them as comic issues then? Sure, it's fun for the extremely rare comic book collectors interested, or minority Ninjago fans who care, all of which themselves are a minority of adult readers who even consider the story in the first place. Just get the graphic novel out and call it good. So to speak, because, you know, even though that book will end up available digitally as well, physical copies will eventually phase out. Again, not that those younger readers have permission to use devices to read them digitally, of course. It's only really good for the older readers looking to consume canon content. However, like LEGO's apps, having something available digitally requires reapproval, and if we reach a point where physical versions of these stories are not in production, and LEGO or the publisher decides not to renew the digital options for their books, these canon stories will become lost to time. Fan-made repositories of these stories are great, but they're incredibly hard to find, and can often be challenging to wade through. They only serve to help the most dedicated, who are a stark minority compared to the rest. And it's the most dedicated who yearn for more stories in the world they love. Only those who are dedicated now will have the luxury of owning physical copies of these stories. But what about the fans yet to come? Like LEGO's sets, these books will only be relevant for the time they're supposed to be marketed, but once that time is past, the fans coming in later will be out of luck. This is not sustainable for a story whose main canon narrative is so easily accessible as Ninjago's, especially for one as profitable as this for the LEGO group. It's an unfortunate future that, honestly, looks like it's about to get worse. Recently, Scholastic and Amit Publishing released details on books set to release in 2023, and this includes a book I will not be naming here or showing its title due to spoilers, that continues the story after Ninjago's newest season at the time of his writing, crystallized. This season has been heavily promoted as the finale of the ongoing narrative of Ninjago, implying that what's to come is something new. Whether that's entirely true remains to be seen. However, one detail I can call attention of this book is that it uses the terminology on its cover, two untold stories. The synopsis of this book is quite important to the lore of the characters involved, which shocks me due to it being great as a subject of another season of the show. That same terminology can imply that we are not going back to this world to tell these stories in the show as well. Whether this means changes around the horizon for the story of Ninjago is not a discussion for this video. What is the fact that, if this is leading towards a new storyline where the old one is no longer involved, and we have to resort to books to enjoy the canon narrative's continuation, this means that all the forthcoming stories have the possibility of suffering from all of the issues I brought up in this video. Writing meant for kids only? Teetering on the edge of canon and non-canon? Chance of going out of production early? Possibility of digital options for preservation no longer being available in time? I can't think of a worse death than that. Might as well release these stories in animated shorts sometime early in the year to keep older fans engaged if you can't make a whole series off of it. The only piece I have is that this is still a hypothetical situation, and we can only hope that no matter what happens, the narrative we love will be preserved and respected. I can't see that happening unless a decision is made on how the future of the story is to be written and understanding who these stories are going for. I hope that this video has brought those issues to light and maybe someday we can see some change. Curious, are there any Ninjago books you love? Which would they be? You can let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, you can like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell. In 2011, I was one of those people who went crazy with Ninjago's books just to get more story, but once I started realizing the character encyclopedias were making up info, I'm one of those people who stopped reading them. The writing towards younger readers these days only keeps me at bay even more.